Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, was Malcolm X right? And in particular, was Malcolm X right about the necessity of a black separatist state? So, here's my take on this in a sort of roundabout manner. So the first thing to say is, obviously, the event which precipitated this sort of race discussion as such was the death of George Floyd. But nobody really cares about George Floyd. If you have any debates or come across anything about George Floyd, whether he was a good guy, was he a bad guy, I mean, you know, if he just forged a $20 note, having a guy sitting on his neck, probably not good. But if there's any nuance about the background to his arrest or whatever, people just ignore that and go, well, you know, there's all this systemic racism in America, and it's just an excuse to wheel out lots of grievances that they have. So George Floyd's event precipitated it, and the lockdown for that matter, because people were fed up of being indoors. But no one particularly cares about his death in the way that they cared, say, about Trayvon Martin or some of the others when it was the Gentle Giant. What was he called? I can't remember. The big black guy who got shot by the American policeman. No one really cares about it. It's just about reeling off the list of laundry list of issues that they have. But back to the police, because this is really what sort of precipitated it directly. I mean, the police are a problem in a certain, well, they are. There's lots of problems with the American police. I mean, with the black activist, I would be sort of in agreement in a certain sense that there's a problem, although why they're a problem, they may differ in their justification. So here's a quick list that I put together for this. So one problem with the police, and I think it's probably the worst, is they have qualified immunity. Basically, what a regular citizen would do and get arrested or prosecuted for, the police don't. There's basically a higher bar of sort of badness that the police have to jump over before they are prosecuted at all for anything, which means that they're significantly more violent in their interactions than regular people would be. That's why you get all the dog shootings, etc., etc. And also, I can't remember the name of the guy. There's a white guy the police shot when he had his hands over his head. These are things that are going to happen when you have qualified immunity. There's also lots of there's the drug war in particular, which disproportionately affects the blacks. Now, why that does and why they take drugs and why there's lots is another question, but there is. And, you know, the drug war created like no-knock raids and lots of heavy-handed policing, and of course you've empowered people like the DEA, the Drugs Enforcement Agency, I think their name is, and of course prostitution as well, slightly less pronounced in black communities, at least relative to drugs. So, you know, that's a problem. They're going around finding crime and poking the nose in where there isn't really any crime being committed in any genuine sense. And of course, as the police's civil asset forfeiture, they can basically just take your stuff if they think it was a proceeds of crime. I don't know how much that's done in the black community, but I imagine it could with relation to drugs. It's like, oh no, mate, you got your car due to drugs. It's like, can you prove it? Oh, you have to prove it. You have to prove that you got it legit, and they'll reverse the burden of proof and they'll take things from you. Related to qualified immunity, there's lots of stop and search where they don't have probable cause. To be fair, this probably started primarily with traffic offences. But, you know, the police go around poking their noses in when they think, well, you know, some crime might be committed. They don't have any real bar of evidence to go through. And related to that, a lot of the time, the police don't actually focus on crime that people care about. They're all about traffic offences or politically correct crimes, etc., etc. They are there, just to box tick or to virtue signal. And then, of course, you have lots of extra police power of detaining without trial, except with terrorism. Now, that doesn't really affect the blacks particularly, although it does in some occasions. So there are problems with the police. There's certainly a lot of problems with the police, and I would want to get rid of all that. And that would make things better. However, even with those things, there is really no sound argument to say that there is somehow, quote unquote, systemic racism in the police. I think the most interesting statistic here is this. And I believe this is taken from the FBI. For every 10,000 black people arrested for violent crime, 3 are killed. And for every 10,000 white people arrested for violent crime, 4 are killed. Now, you could make the claim that, there's a lower bar that blacks have to do to be arrested by the police, but you're going to have to do quite a little gymnastics to at least make it on par, let alone show that somehow blacks are systematically victimized by the police. The amounts of arrests and things, etc., are just in proportion with the amount of crime that blacks commit overall. I mean, they just commit more crime. And a good bit of counter-narrative information. Everyone always focuses on black crime, but black and white crime is 9 times higher, at least according to the interracial crime incidence of 2018, which is taken from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. That said, of course, everyone forget that most crime is intraracial. Most of the crime is black on black, if it's black, and then white on white. So there really is no, in my view, good evidence for systemic racism in the police. And even if you got rid of qualified immunity, the drug war, civil asset forfeiture, etc., there would still be disparities in the amount of crimes committed amongst races, because different ethnic groups commit different amounts of crime. For example, the East Asians commit very little. Are they somehow less than whites? I mean, is it that the police are favorably disposed towards them and let them off? Or is it that, different people groups in different places have different cultures and, act differently? So you're always going to end up with differing outcomes. So just on crime, most criminals have an IQ between 75 and 90, and the black average IQ is 85. Now, they're pretty much so given that information and standard deviations either side, you kind of expect there to proportionally be more black crime than other groups. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it has to be genetic necessarily. It could be cultural. It could be due to opportunities, etc., etc. You could make that claim. But that's pretty, could make sense. I mean, so IQ, for example, is associated with, lower IQ is associated with a higher time preference. You don't wait, and so you just take things when you see it. So they don't plan for the future or see the future events, and that's what you tend to find in prisons. Prisoners aren't the brightest bunch in most cases. So if a certain group has, for whatever reason, a lower average IQ, no, not too low because you could be too stupid to commit crime, then you're going to commit more crime. Makes sense. But let's leave aside that. Let's leave aside criminality. That's sort of controversial in certain respects. What a lot of the race activists point to is just any difference in outcome. They somehow believe that there is going to be that any difference in outcome must be a result of discrimination and racism. There can't be differing outcomes because different groups are different. It just simply isn't there. So, for example, I would always expect there to be more black sprinters in the 100 meters. Why? Because blacks on average have West African ones have more fast twitch muscles in their legs, which make them good for sprinting. Therefore, I would expect that. Different groups are going to have different outcomes, and they act differently. So the Jews act differently. They earn more, they have a different sort of intellectual culture, which makes them do well in a particular society, and they will do well. So when it comes to the people crying racism, BLM, etc., really what comes down to it is they point to unequal outcomes and claim it's discrimination. They don't point to the fact that it might be behavior and choice among particular groups could cause that. They just argue from this absurd determinism. One argument, though, I do think the BLM people have, which is reasonably legitimate, is that American culture is broadly white, or it isn't as much as it used to be, but it was historically. And they feel kind of, left out. And I think there's arguments to that to some extent. So, for example, if I was born in Japan to white parents, I would still feel probably that, Japanese culture was kind of created for the Japanese, and I was always a little bit of an outsider. Now, they might be hospitable towards me, fair enough. That's all to the good. But, it's always going to be different, and there's no way I can expect them to change the entire Japanese culture. So a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant will feel at home in Japan. So I do think that's a fair argument, but then that just brings to the question is, well, if you don't feel at home in a particular place, why stay? So to the Malcolm X question with the ethno-state for the blacks, I think that there is a certain group of people in the black community who, even if all those things were changed and the outcomes for blacks were a bit better, would keep thinking that they're in a white country with white rules, white laws. And they might also think that all their problems are due to the white man. That seems to be a prevalent narrative amongst many of them. And it's perpetuated by people like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. And any opportunity, they will wheel it out for their own advantage and to create racial disharmony. So I don't really see those people going away. So I think, in a sense, on this issue, Malcolm X is right. What is required to dissipate racial tension in America is a separatist black state, or maybe two, maybe in the north and the south, depending on where the populations are. And those blacks who think, I'm in a white country, I want to be in a black sort of West African culture country, they can leave and they can go and create their own state there and run themselves as they see fit. And those blacks who want to stay in the integrated state, they can stay. A lot of the time, racial tensions aren't always that great in America. There's lots of blacks who get on well with whites, etc. So there are ones who are quite well integrated. But those who aren't and feel like they're always being pushed down, Malcolm X, take control of your own life. Take control of your own life. Forge your own destiny and go into a black ethno-state. I think that's an entirely reasonable proposition and one which deserves more airing. Tim, what do you think?
I'm going to point out the features and the bugs of this case. The first problem I have with Michele Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, or most of these groups, is in some ways they prove too much. If the United States is so bad, if it's just started at 1619, it's just drenched in the history of white supremacy, and you could find nasty quotes about this. And this is to a certain extent, I think, a lot of, hack Democratic activists who call Republicans racist to engage in special pleading. They won't own up the fact that Woodrow Wilson, just read the recent Vox article on Woodrow Wilson, just read some of the Lincoln quotes that he said. So if the United States is this terrible monster that Michele Alexander and many of these other progressives like to argue it is. Well, first of all, they're part of it. I mean, Hillary Clinton called black super predators. Bill Clinton exploded the prison population. So they're as much as part of it. And we had Keith Preston recently on saying exactly that as well. Just as much part of it. And Thaddeus Russell agrees with that as well. In a way, they prove too much. I mean, what hope does this system have of reforming itself if you think it's that bad? So now Malcolm X said you don't want to integrate with a sinking ship. And this gets into which I think is the feature and the problem with the case. So is the U.S. a sinking ship? I'm going to read something of Alexander McIntyre, and I think this is a problem for people like Cornel West, for example, who is to a certain extent a high priestess of the woke left, and the SJW left. I'm going to read something of Alexander McIntyre in his wonderful book After Virtue. Marxist socialism is at its core deeply optimistic. However thoroughgoing its criticism of capitalism and bourgeois institutions may be, it is committed to asserting that within the society constituted by those institutions, all the human and material preconditions of a better future are being accumulated. Yet the moral impoverishment of advanced capitalism is what so many Marxists agree that it is. Where are these resources for the future to be derived? It is not surprising that at this point Marxism tends to produce its own version of Übermensch's, Lukács' ideal proletarian, Lenin's ideal revolutionary, and so forth. When Marxism does not become Weberian social democracy or crude tyranny, it tends to become Nietzschean fantasy. One of the most admirable aspects of Trotsky's cold resolution was his refusal for all such fantasies. A Marxist who took Trotsky's last writings with great seriousness would be forced into pessimism, quite alien to the Marxist tradition, and in becoming a pessimist, he would in an important way have ceased to be a Marxist, for he would now see no tolerable alternative set of political and economic structures which could be brought into place to replace the structures of advanced capitalism. And this I think is brilliant analysis by Alexander McIntyre on the failure of Marxism. And I to a certain extent think that to the extent that Black Lives Matter, Michele Alexander, Cornel West, and everyone else borrows from Marxism, it's exhausted. I've gotten into a few arguments on it. I don't really know what these people want. On some level, what they want is the Garden of Eden. And ironically, many of these people are actually atheists too. What they want is some version of the Garden of Eden. Marxism failed. No, as McIntyre says, no tolerable set of political institutions. So I'm going to go back to the question of, is the U.S. a sinking ship? It depends. I think the United States, and that matter Britain and the West, is the cleanest, dirtiest shirt. The cleanest, dirtiest shirt. So to a certain extent, you can create a separatist state if you want, but in some ways, is the United States that bad? There's some arguments to make the cops are racist the other way. I think in certain schools they have quotas about who can get punished. I mean, these are insane. These are insane such situations. I mean, in the last 50 years, the formal political culture has bent over backwards to help this group, and they're still complaining. So to some level, I don't really know what these people want. They've been given a large amount of stuff in terms of protections and so forth. You're dealing with man. You know, in monoethnic societies, Marxist socialism failed to a large extent. Now, whether or not Sweden or this is the actual utopia is of some question. But nonetheless, there's a certain limit of these are just human problems. So Swithin, what do you make of my case so far? Is the United States as bad as they are claiming, or the West broadly?
No, they're not as bad as they claim, and certainly on racial matters, which I attempted to explain previously, at least with respect to criminality in the police. Yes, there's certainly huge problems with the West, and the West is in relative decline. I mean, that's certainly true. it would be interesting to see post-coronavirus what the Chinese will be like, because they were sort of like the up and the coming ascendant world power, as it were. So whether that's going to put any dampeners on that. So no, I mean, America is far from the hellhole which the BLM supporters claim. And you're right with the political culture, post-civil rights and quotas. I mean, you could equally make the case for black privilege. So, for example, there was an ACLU professor who has been suspended because some black students said, "Oh no, we're so traumatized that George Floyd got killed," which I'm highly dubious of. But let's suppose they were. So we don't have to do the exam. They'll be nice to us. And he was like, "No, everyone has to do the exam." And by saying everyone had to do the exam, he got death threats, and he's now under police protection. I mean, this is just insane. The amount that, and also, Black Lives Matter in a sense have cultural hegemony. I mean, since like the 1980s or maybe the 1990s, I don't think anybody in mainstream sort of cultural artifacts have been able to get away with anything you might consider sort of pro-white explicitly. You know, everyone's like to, dampen down sort of your kind of national cultural sort of white heritage or whatever, because, that would be perceived as racist. And now, I mean, you look at, I think there was one article once that was saying in one of the later series of The Walking Dead, every heterosexual relationship on screen was interracial. And the only intraracial ones were homosexual. It's like, this really strikes of like white cis patriarchy that like a mainstream show has this. I mean, they control the culture. I mean, that's why they can get away with this stuff. It's why they can get away with toppling statues, is because they've just got so far with them. So it's far from the hellhole that they portray. But my point is this: there will still be people who think, black people will think, yes, it is a hellhole and it's white man's fault. And frankly, we don't really want them in society. We want them to go away and do their own thing, and then they can take responsibility for themselves. Who wants a subset of people there? How are we going to have a nice sort of harmonious functional society if you have a vociferous minority who are just going to constantly play the race card all the time? I mean, you just don't want them there. And I missed on my earlier point, on a general libertarian argument, having smaller states is better. If people want to leave, it's easier to leave. And also it would just reduce the power of the US federal government. So on a libertarian angle, it's preferable as well. So yeah, America is nowhere near as bad as they portray. Is it a sinking ship? Yes, probably. It's certainly in relative decline. But compared to the alternatives, it isn't that bad. Otherwise, lots of people wouldn't be trying to go through the currently non-existent wall across Mexico.
At this point, I would continue to agree with you on the grounds that the United States is not as bad. Would the separatist state be advisable? It's worth pointing out, and Jordan Peterson pointed this out, that if blacks were grouped, they'd be the 15th wealthiest country in the world. And Walter Williams, libertarian, he's been at the Mises Institute, black libertarian, would say something similar. And heck, Cornel West would even say that in betrayal of the black elite, now he's a Marxist, of course, he'd complain that many of them got comfy in the sort of American capitalist empire. Condoleezza Rice was George Bush's, I think it was Secretary of State or Secretary of War, whatever they call it now. I forget the precise name. So if you like, so in some ways, some ways blacks have had high positions in the American military establishment, in American social culture, American corporate culture, and America is the dominant society both militarily, culturally, and economically. So again, they are a minority in the United States, but nonetheless they are a minority that's wealthier than most majority countries in the world, even in the world. So this begs the question of, would they really want a separatist state? Well, it depends on what they mean by a separatist state. It's worth pointing out that let's think about the classic quote-unquote ethnic separatist state, Israel. Is Israel a pure ethnic state? No. Even if you take out the Palestinians entirely, Israel is not a pure ethnic state. There is a population of Arabs in the state. There's a population of Christians. And the Arabs have had a see at their government every year. And plenty of Arabs serve in the Israeli defense forces as well, although it's voluntarily. So they do quite well. I think a similar relationship exists with American blacks as well in the United States. In my opinion, I think people like Walter Williams would agree. Now, this depends on what Malcolm X was. It's worth pointing out Malcolm X in some ways was a social conservative. You should read Malcolm X's comments on drugs. He thought that drugs were a sort of Scrooge to keep the masses under control. He was a Muslim, and he wasn't just like a fake Muslim. From my understanding, he was a legit Muslim. So in this regard, I would argue that he's a social conservative, no different than the people that founded the United States, no different than the people that founded Israel, and no different than the people that, to a certain extent, founded the Iranian Revolution as well. So would this separatist state work? It depends on its character. If it's this sort of Marxist state, then I think it's going to fail quite miserably, as do most Marxist state in a way fail quite miserably. And that's McIntyre's point. It would be just like a Weberian social democracy. Would it now if it became like some sort of I think it would somewhat effective, but it would probably recreate many of the same internal dynamics that they complain that the whites have. They would probably be classes within the state. There would probably be an exploiter class in the state. There'd probably be corporations in the state. If they did that, I could see them working out somewhat, but it's not going to be Cornel West Stream. It's going to be at best some version of Singapore, Rwanda, or Israel, some version of that. It's worth pointing out that back in the 1870s, the Lincoln and some Seward, I think, had the Back to Africa, Monrovia. It's worth pointing out the blacks that went there became the ruling class there. So it would not be, the separatist state would probably end up being quite fundamentally conservative if it was successful. So no, is that a good thing? I don't know. I don't know. Which is why I don't think it's that much of a race problem, or at least since 1960, it's been that much of a race problem. And if it is still a race problem, then what hope is there reform? So again, I agree that it could work, and it might work, but most of the people here don't really want separatism. The most people on the left, if they're pushed, are probably pushing to some sort of one world government. Although they would deny that, they would say you're just a John Birch conspiracy theorist. This to me is the tendency. The tendency is not for separatism. The tendency for most people, and in this regard, the blacks are just, black leadership tends to agree with the left in this regard, of just creating this sort of globalist one world fantasy. So there's no hope for this happening from what most of their leadership happens today. Malcolm X has been erased from history, funnily enough. And Malcolm X's comments on white liberals are hilarious. So if you want to fill them in on what he said about white liberals, I think that they're absolutely hilariously a total thought crime.
So here are some of some juiciest Malcolm X quotes. The real criminal is the white liberal, the political hypocrite. And it is these legal crooks who pose as our friends, force us into a life of crime, and then use us to spread the white man's evil vices in our community among our own people. The white liberals are nothing but political hypocrites who use our people as political footballs, only to get bills passed that will increase their own power. Some pretty good stuff there, I think. To the functionality of the black ethno-state, I mean, as to who would live there, I mean, I suppose the way you probably set it up to begin with would be to go or poll people how many people in the black community would want to go to the black ethno-state, and then originally have an all-black population. Now, this could be like a new state, sort of a new area just developed for them to live in, or you could try and carve out an area to minimize the amount of people who have to move or whatever. A detailed proposal of something similar for this is Michael Hart, who had a speech called Racial Partition in America. It's an American Renaissance back in the 90s. He's on YouTube. It's worth watching on sort of a practical, pragmatic way of doing it. I think his idea of a single black state and a white state, interestingly enough, he probably wants at least two of each, but leave that aside. But the idea would be that, you know, the black state could then have their own immigration policies they see fit. They could allow in who they saw fit, who they wanted to, and you know, whether it worked or whether it failed or not, in a sense, to my mind, is not really the issue. The issue is one of self-determination. Those people, those blacks will want to create a distinctively black culture in America, of a society of norms and laws which are peculiarly from sort of the West African heritage, filtered through the historical story of slavery, etc., etc. So they feel like they are at home. Whether it works or not, with respect to outcomes, yeah, I think you could probably still have the same problems as you have now. But the crucial difference, in my view, would be there would be very little way of blaming the white man, and it wouldn't be something which is inflaming racial tensions. Now, you could also one criticism of this policy would be that, oh yeah, if you'd have a black ethno-state, it would just be a way of shafting the black man and giving him the worst area and just kick him out. It's like, well, no, you do your best to have it as an amicable settlement as possible. Get someone like Louis Farrakhan on board, the current leader of the Nation of Islam. So they feel like they've got a good deal. And then you see how it goes. I mean, would it be a Marxist state? I don't know. It might be. Or it could be, as you point out, a relatively conservative one. As I say, the crucial point is those people who want to do things on their own can do, and reducing the geographical size of the US federal government will limit the power of the US federal government. People will be able to move between these states, have genuine independence. So some blacks go to the ethno-state, decide they don't like it, they go to the integrated state, fine. Or the blacks in the integrated state go, well, you know what, we want to go to the black separate state, we'll move, it's better. And so you get sort of genuine sort of competition in governance. So, yeah, you could get all the differences in outcomes, but they can't blame it on the white man, and that's my main aim here. But I would agree, you know, is there that much support for separatism on the left? Well, no, because it's just an excuse to further egalitarian Marxism, basically. So they have sort of little interest in doing so. But I think if it was given more airtime, I think in certain communities it would be quite popular. And obviously, the state doesn't need to be very big. I mean, what's it like? Look, Liechtenstein, Andorra, they're tiny. It could even be that small. The point would be it's there, and if you wanted to go to your black state and live in a black community, in a black culture, you could go.
I want to push off this point of what would the character of the state be? If it's remotely successful, my guess is it wouldn't have any character of a Marxist state. If anything, it would be quite if it's remotely successful, and if anything, it'd be quite conservative. And this is one of the interesting things which Malcolm X said about drugs in his Ballet or the Bullet speech. The social philosophy of black nationalism only means that we have to get together and remove alcoholism, drug addiction, and other evils that are destroying the moral fiber of our community. This is what Frederick Douglass said before. The white man wants black men to stay immoral, unclean, and ignorant. As long as we stay in these conditions, we'll keep on begging, and he will control us. So in a way, all this, in a way, the war on drugs, and Thaddeus Russell points this out in his history, the war on drugs was done in an attempt, not out of necessarily a racist attempt, was done to try to improve it. And Heather McDonald of the Cato Institute would point this out as well. Thomas Sowell would point this out as well. That getting drugs off the street and out of the community is to a large extent a social good from the position of people who want a functioning, high flourishing society. I am a libertarian. Although I've never actually used any illegal drugs, even of alcohol, I've hardly ever used that as well. I don't see a need for them. I don't see much social use for them either. I don't ban them, but I can see why the Puritans and why social conservatives and why Malcolm X in this regard would want them banned. In most Islamic countries, from my understanding, these things are illegal. And I think actually, and there's also other things that one of these woke warriors would want that are illegal that they would totally be against as well. But we don't need to necessarily get into that right now. But nonetheless, if this is remotely successful, it's going to be quite conservative, which again puts it totally in opposition to the current mainstream woke left, which is why it's not going to happen. I don't think you and me, or any libertarian will be opposed to this. And I find all these sort of defund the police movements to be kind of bizarre. I mean, to a certain extent, sure, defund the police, but what are these? What are you going to do when a burglar comes? Now, you could take the approach that it's rare, okay, which is somewhat the libertarian approach, or you could say defend yourself. But then again, we're complaining about people like George Zimmerman defending themselves. So they want it both ways. And what they really want, and we've discussed this with Keith Preston on a recent episode about does the left advocate for a police state, and he described it putting the mouse in charge of the cheese. In functionality, they just want to put the feds in charge. And even Noam Chomsky, in a macro level, he just wants the United Nations to be in charge of everything, which is the most insane tyrannical system imaginable. So could this separatist state happen? It might. I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to it. I mean, as long as there's some reasonable and amicable settlement on both sides. And heck, if people are out here posting all this stuff on Facebook, if they care so much, and this is what some of them want, why not give it to them? I mean, this if you want to exercise your guilt and your burden and set them out, this is the perfect opportunity. So give up some land. I don't know, you could pick some spot of land and go for it, or just pick a city, or pick a neighborhood. But then this is the ironic part. This sounds like what Rothbard was saying 40 years ago, which oftentimes gets parodied about. People make fun of it. People say libertarians are idiots. People say they're insane. But this to me is totally silly to a certain extent, considering what they think about these other issues in other areas. Swithin?
Yeah, with how they would function, I do think a successful black state would be relatively culturally conservative. I mean, Thomas Sowell has pointed this out. The black family was, if you look at divorce rates, etc., and illegitimate children, was actually lower in the black community than it was in the white community prior to the 1960s. It seems very much to be the war on poverty and the welfare state which has precipitated a large increase in divorce and illegitimacy. And yeah, certainly, I don't think there's much sort of sociological evidence, which is as strong as if you were raised by your biological parents who are married before you were born, your life outcomes are significantly better than any other arrangement. And so you'd certainly have that. And I think if you did have that, kind of drugs would disappear to a large extent, not entirely, but would go down. Stefan Molyneux has kind of made the argument based on the work of Gabor Mate, I think I remember his name right, which is essentially that childhood trauma, etc., basically means you're looking for something to fill the hole in your sort of life, and there's some argument with respect to sort of brain activity and things, and drugs just make you feel normal because you've sort of lacked sort of parental involvement, etc. So I do think that could be the case, and it could be reasonably successful if it goes down that line. And yeah, on the libertarian argument, if these people want a black state, if you want to create Wakanda, if I remember correctly from Black Panther, not Black Panda, although that's somewhat of a current meme. Go for it. Let 1,000 countries bloom. The crucial thing is to get the feds out. I mean, this is the ridiculous thing about the defund the police. All that will happen is they'll just get the state police to do more. And then they'll go, oh no, the state police is racist. Who's the least racist? The FBI. And then you'll just increase the federal power instead. There's no real idea behind how you deal with crime. Although I suppose they're Marxist utopians. They probably think in the absence of sort of private ownership of the means of production, somehow crime will disappear. I think some of them probably think that. But of course, the obvious solution if you don't have the police is a militia. But then, of course, then you're racist if you advocate for a militia group. So, yeah, if people want to go, let them go. Great. All the better for it. People are going to get on better if they can disassociate with the people they want to disassociate with and associate with the people they want to associate with. If it happens to be on ethnic lines, it's on ethnic lines. And this is one thing with respect to the what I mentioned before with respect to The Walking Dead. I think it's a quote from Martin Luther King. It says there's no more sort of ethnic or racial separation than on a Sunday morning. But Martin Luther King was wrong. It wasn't between black and white churches. It's actually in marriage. If you look at the marriage figures, overwhelmingly intra-racial or intra-ethnic. There's been an increase in interracial marriage, which interestingly, if whites is normally a white man and an East Asian lady, which is contrary to at least the English portrayal of that in the media. They always go, it's a black man and a white woman is typically what they go with, which is not statistically the most prominent. Is that people prefer marry people who are similar to them and happen to be on ethnic and racial lines. And so if people prefer them, the traits and things associated with that, then is it a big leap to go that people would tend to like a culture which predominated with people who look more like them because being of the same race and sort of ethnic culture, historical background means that they're going to have similar norms and values, which means they get on with them. Like, the case is relatively self-evident.
I will make a few final concluding remarks, so I think we'll wrap it up here. But I think this is, again, speaks back to the inner contradictions of the Marxist left, as well as most of as well to a certain extent of liberalism. Although I view making smaller states as part of liberalism, so I don't view this as a contradiction. They do think that in a classless society there wouldn't be any crime. This is not a parody of theory. They think this is an actual theory. I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what humans are. There are plenty of crimes that happen of people that have the look exactly like, and that's another funny thing about this whole crime statistic. Most of it's intra-race as well, so which speaks back to why and so forth. But they are that they do think that, and B, as far as separatism, which is my second point, go ahead and do it. Go ahead and do it and try it. They may find a way to continue blaming them, but I think as the further away it gets, the harder it's them to blame them. Even Slavoj Zizek was recently said in some interview that anytime a problem happens in some country in Africa, the first impulse is for progressives to blame British or French or Belgium or colonialism. And Slavoj Zizek, in his sort of almost right-wing mentality, although he gets accused of fascism, funnily enough, said, the most he sounds like Malcolm X here. The most white supremacist move, to a certain extent, is to think that even when blacks treat others blacks, the evil comes from whites. It was an outside contaminant. It's as if before the Europeans came to Africa, it was pure harmony. And this goes back to these sort of, this is a joke. And same way with South America, I'll throw that well. This is another thing the left wants. Cortez landed in the United States. Cortez landed in Mexico, current day Mexico. The Aztecs were fighting amongst themselves. It was the native allies that toppled the capital city of the Aztec Empire. So again, this is a misunderstanding of human nature with this sort of hack race theory. Do they make points at times? Yes. But I would say Michele Alexander's case is basically false. Thad Russell, Heather McDonald can just dismantle that case quite easily. The 1619 case is just absurd. Mainstream historians think it's absurd as well, although they're increasingly being McCarthyized if you disagree with this. But nonetheless, those are my concluding remarks. Swithin, do you have anything else to add?
With Africa, yes, it is certainly the case that the immediate impulse, anything goes wrong in Africa, it's the white man, which is ridiculous in one respect. They were killing each other all the time, have tribal warfare, etc. I mean, a good example of this is, again, he points out South America, which Mel Gibson's Apocalypto shows well. It shows how brutal sort of the Aztecs were, etc. And it is a bit politically incorrect at the end because it seems like the white settlers from Spain are coming to kind of save, the Christian settlers are coming to save the day at the end. Well, not exactly, but they kind of appear and they kind of are portrayed in a kind of a good light. It's like, are they going to bring civilization to the savage? But with Africa, I think there is a case to be made that the sort of colonialism caused an issue, primarily on the creation of the countries, because you basically just fomented more intertribal fighting. Sort of Rwanda, I think it was the Hutus and the Tutsis. It's like, no, have a Tutsi state, have a Hutu state, kind of just like separate yourselves. Just do your own thing. When you have two groups and they're all trying to vie for the reins of power, this is not going to be a recipe for harmony. Because if the Hutus get into power, the Tutsis will blame everything on the Hutus, even if it's the Tutsis' fault, and vice versa. Only when you have a reasonable amount of responsibility and independence can you own up to your own mistakes and improve yourself. And that's really what I see this proposal as allowing to take place. Also with Africa, how bad it is. I mean, it's the white man. I mean, South Africa is a good example here. The white man is receding in his influence in South Africa, and things are getting worse. There was a poll, I think, from people who lived under the apartheid regime and the current regime amongst blacks, and I think more blacks, if they were alive in the apartheid era and now, preferred the apartheid. Now, obviously, they didn't prefer everything with apartheid, but if you took it as a whole package, this isn't necessarily saying that apartheid was a good thing, but, South Africa, not a particularly great place. Neither, for that matter, is Zimbabwe. Although, I think slightly better now that Mugabe is gone. So, if they'd have enough state, yes, they could still blame the white man, but the further it goes into history, the less impact that would have, especially if it was all done on a of major black leaders who had integrity in the eyes of the community and go, this is a fair settlement, we're doing it on our own, and it's not a case of, oh, we're leaving now, but we're going to keep borders that we drew from Paris in 1864.
One more comment here. One of the interesting things about tearing down Confederate statues, if you want to look at the last major group that has threatened the United States legitimately, it was probably the Confederacy. Now, I'm not interested right now in having a discussion of causes of the Civil War, but if you want to look at a group that did a good job trying to break away from the United States, it was the Confederacy. And since then, no one's really threatened the United States feasibly. Maybe at the Battle of Midway, the Japanese made a slight attempt to overthrow the United States. Maybe the United States could have easily built more aircraft carriers, even if they were all destroyed. It may have taken an extra 6 months, but it was finished quite. The Battle of the Pacific after Midway was basically, it was just a matter of how much the United States is going to push out. So again, they're tearing down some of the best critics of the United States. And Robert E. Lee, in a letter, wrote after the United States would be illiberal at home and tyrannical abroad. So, go ahead, tear down these Confederate statues. I don't have any personal inclination either way to this. I'm from the North, so it doesn't really bother me per se. But it is worth pointing that out. Swithin?
Oh, just as a last comment, they're tearing statues down in Britain. There was a guy in Bristol, I can't remember his name, who founded lots of schools and put them into hospitals, but he was involved in the slave trade, and so therefore his statue must fall. I am highly suspicious of this mentality. It's a way of erasing history. I think that's the main thing, to forget what was past, and so that you can basically start at year zero. It's also a problem of seeing everything in black and white terms. If you have a single taint, then you must just be ostracized and you must be disappeared. It is not a good mentality to have a functioning civilized society, and emboldening these pulling down of these statues, I think, is a very dangerous thing. I mean, even if I was Russian, I would have been opposed to removing the statues of Lenin, the historical works that are in public, and you can remember who this guy was. A warning from history in stone. So I would not. Yes.
I'm going to add to that, but in here, I'm going to add to that. I actually think the one of the mistakes after the fall of communism was tearing down too much of the regime. I think in some of the stuff that replaced it might have been somewhat architecturally, to a certain extent, might have been worse. Although some of the stuff was clearly bad. And one of the problems I in general have is, where does this end? I mean, are we going to tear down the Athenian Acropolis, which is somewhat destroyed a little bit? It's somewhat destroyed. I was there recently, back in 2019. Are we going to tear that down? Because many Greeks owned slaves. The American founding fathers modeled their country off the Greeks. And actually, if you read certain histories about the fire eaters, they adopted the Greek mentality of slaveholding. So we may as well destroy all Greek monuments in Greece, and rename any town in the south that's named Athens or Sparta or Rhodes, or lots of towns are named after these Greek and then these British and then these American type figures. So I don't see any end to this. I don't see any end to this. And I also don't think, I also don't think Christianity is immune either, because Paul did tell a person to return to his slave. Now they did have jubilees and other things but that exists as a fact, whether you like that or not. So I don't see where this ends. I just see it as just basically eating almost all culture and destroying almost all monuments. Which is why I'm on here. It's somewhat politically incorrect to defend this stuff, Malcolm X, to a large extent, I would argue, is politically incorrect as well. But that's why I'm defending this case.
Yeah, final thing just on the statues and whole slavery thing. What's rarely pointed out is the Americans and the sort of British didn't go out to the middle of Africa and pick up slaves from the jungle. They took them from other black slave traders because, unfortunately, slavery is basically ubiquitous in history. And actually, the first peoples to officially outlaw it and try and get rid of it was the British Empire, which was run by lots of mean, nasty old cis white patriarchal men. And with that, I will rest my case that Malcolm X on the black ethno-state was right. So, thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family or anyone who will find it of interest. If you would like to get into contact with us with ideas for the show or just some general comments, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibernyshow@gmail.com.